What does it mean for a sword to be holy? We're going to talk about that today on Talking Fables. Hi, I'm your host, and this is Talking Fables, the podcast where we talk about stories, the ones we grew up with and the ones we're discovering now. Because stories have something to teach us, whether it's about life or death or anything in between. And today, we're going to look at a story that helped shape our modern conception of good versus evil, the legend of King Arthur, and the sword and the stone. And we're going to focus on the sword itself because when you think about the legendary weapons of fiction, there are some pretty big names out there, right? You got Gandalf's Glamdring or Sting, Aragorn's Anduril, even Luke Skywalker's lightsaber. But few have captured the popular imagination quite like Excalibur, the sword of King Arthur. Even if you aren't familiar with the many tales starring the once and future king, chances are you still know that Excalibur is a magical sword imbued with otherworldly power. And its very name has become synonymous with righteous authority, so much so that we use phrases like Sword of Excalibur to describe any really awesome sword, regardless of whether or not it has anything to do with the Arthurian legends. But what makes Excalibur such an iconic weapon, both within its own fictional world and in the real world? Well, let's pull out the trusty old Holy Bible, grab a rock and head over to Camelot to find out. As I mentioned in my last episode, we'll be following the original sources as closely as we can for these discussions, which means today we're diving into Arthurian lore. But since there were no surviving contemporary written sources for the medieval period, we'll be examining how scholars believe the stories evolved from early written accounts. In order to discuss how Excalibur came to embody divine kingship, we need to first figure out where it came from. Because despite what you might expect, given how iconic the sword is, Excalibur isn't actually all that old as far as Arthurian relics go. It doesn't appear in Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain, the foundational text for most Arthurian lore, and it's not mentioned in any of the poems attributed to the legendary poet Taliesin, another important source for early Arthurian history. In fact, the earliest surviving reference to Excalibur comes from a single line in a poem called The Dream of Ron, written by the 12th century poet Marie de France. In it, she refers to the sword as Caladbolg, meaning white harvest. This may refer to the sword's white hilt or pommel, but may also allude to its ability to grant victories to those who wield it. According to one version of the tale, the blade was brought to Britain by a giant called Ridavar, who intended it to be used by his son. But when he saw Arthur as an infant, thought he looked like a destined warrior, and took the sword back, placing it in a lake to be claimed by whoever was worthy. This story first appears in the 12th century prose work, The First in Byrony History of the Kings of Britain by a writer known only as the Brute, then shows up again in several later poems, including those by Layamon, Gerald of Wales, and the very prolific 15th century poet and playwright John Lydgate. So how did this simple story lead to Excalibur becoming the ultimate symbol of righteous kingship? Well, one reason is that while many Arthurian tales feature the sword being pulled from a stone or an anvil, as with the more famous Sword in the Stone, the idea of a magically empowered sword embedded in a lake isn't all that common elsewhere in medieval European literature. Because of this, readers associate Caladbolg, and later Excalibur, with Arthur specifically, making it a potent symbol of his unique claim to kingship. Furthermore, the idea of a hero having to prove themselves worthy to claim the weapon gives a sense of legitimacy to their rule, as if they've been singled out by magic to be the one to wield that kind of power. This resonates with audiences because it speaks to the idea that kingship isn't just something you inherit or take by force, but something you're called to by providence. The Brute also took this idea a step further by adding a layer of religious significance to the sword. In his retelling of the tale, he says that after Rithvar placed the sword in the lake, it was guarded by 3 serpents, which served as a test for Arthur. But when he pulled the sword from the lake, the serpents became his servants. From here we see the beginnings of Excalibur's transformation from a tool of war into a holy relic. Snakes are often associated with paganism and viewed as symbols of satanic worship in Christian texts. And by having Arthur conquer them, the narrative implies that Arthur's rule will bring Christianity to Britain. While this might seem like a small detail, it had huge implications for how people viewed Arthur as a leader. Another detail that contributed to Excalibur evolution as a holy relic is the fact that the sword is female. In medieval literature, magic users are often depicted as witches, and witches are commonly associated with the number 3. Similarly, magic swords are often depicted with 2 edges. So by giving Excalibur a 3rd edge, we see a clear invocation of magic. However, this detail also seems to have been lost on most people throughout history. Despite her prominence in the stories, she isn't typically included in illustrations or statues depicting Arthur, nor is she ever referred to in the many film and TV adaptations of the Arthurian legend. Yet her presence in the narratives is undeniable, and highlights how medieval people viewed women in relation to magic and power. There are a few reasons why Excalibur's feminine aspect might have been downplayed over the years. In the medieval period, women were often excluded from positions of power, and featuring a powerful woman who serves as a magic sword could have been seen as too threatening to mainstream audiences. Additionally, during the Victorian era, when the legend saw a resurgence in popularity, there was a strong emphasis on morality and the suppression of female sexuality, so a magic sword with feminine qualities could have been seen as inappropriate or risque. Lastly, the nature of storytelling has changed over time. As stories have been adapted for different mediums, characters have been simplified, and the focus has shifted from complex themes to action and adventure. However, in recent years we've seen a growing interest in exploring the forgotten aspects of folklore. As more and more people learn about the history of the Arthurian legend and the role of women in medieval society, perhaps we'll see a revival of interest in Excalibur not just as a footnote in Arthur's story, but as a powerful force in her own right. Yet even without Excalibur remained an enduring symbol of the divine kingship long after the medieval period ended. During the Renaissance, it was invoked by those who opposed Queen Mary I and supported her half-sister Lady Jane Grey. And later, writers like Shakespeare and Sir Walter Scott drew upon the legend to craft their own stories. And today, Excalibur continues to capture the public imagination. It's featured prominently in films like Sword in the Stone and First and Last King, as well as video games like The Witcher and Total War. So why does this sword continue to resonate with us so deeply? What is it about the idea of a magically empowered blade that speaks to our deepest desires for justice and righteousness? Perhaps it's the idea that there's a weapon out there that can cut through all of the deception and corruption in the world and reveal the truth. Or maybe it's the hope that there's a hero out there who can wield that sword and bring about a new age of peace and prosperity. Whatever the reason, the legend of Excalibur reminds us that there's always hope for a better future, no matter how dark things may seem in the present. Thank you for joining me today on Talking Fables. If you enjoyed this episode and want to help support the show, please consider leaving a like or a review on Apple Podcasts. Also, if you'd like to send in a question for our Ask the Audience segment, you can do so by tweeting at us using the hashtag provided. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and carry a snack.